everyone. Bienvenue. It's nice to see names starting to trickle in. We're going to get started. Nous allons commencer. So I'm gonna pass this over to one of our wonderful interpreters, as this webinar will be bilingual.
Donc, je vais donner la parole à l'un de nos interprètes parce que le webinaire sera bilingue. Rebecca, do you want me to say it in English and French? Or?
That would be wonderful, Peter. Thank
okay,
you.
so this is just the interpreter here. Just if you want to get the interpreting in a few moments, not quite yet, but as soon as we switch it on, the interpreting function will appear on your screen, and you'll see a globe icon at the bottom right that says interpretation. You click on that, and then you choose English. Alors, dans quelques instants, vous allez voir apparaître au bas de l'écran à droite une icône du globe qui dira interprétation. Vous cliquez dessus et ensuite vous choisissez français. Donc, s'il y a des problèmes en cours de route, vous pouvez toujours envoyer un message par chat et quelqu'un de l'équipe va vous aider à régler le problème. If there's ever any problem along the way, you can always send a chat message and someone from the tech team here will help you out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Tiara is going to enact the globe, then we will all be able to hear in the language of our choice. We're just going to wait for that. I see that too, and perhaps others can see that now as well. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. So my name is Rebecca Ironoff, and I'm the Seed Program Manager at the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario. And as such, I'm also the Ontario Regional Coordinator for the Bauta Initiative. And while we're not all gathered in one place today, I would like to acknowledge that I personally live and work and play and grow seeds in Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are part of the Anishinaabe Nation, one of the largest indigenous groups in North America. This land is also the ancestral homes of the Chinatan, who the Wendat, who are just from a little north of here, call the Attawandaran, meaning people of a slightly different language, as both of these nations are Longhouse people who are part of the same language group. I'm in treaty relationship through the Between the Lakes Treaty number 3 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I mention this because I want to share my personal intention to work towards learning more about my responsibilities to this land and to the original seed stewards. But as we all know, land acknowledgements are just the very start of the process of reconciliation. To continue this most essential work, we invite us all to consider questions like, how do we educate ourselves in our responsibilities to this land and to the Indigenous people who have always been here? What does it mean to be honest and generous treaty land inhabitants? How can we as individuals and organizations support justice and food sovereignty and seed sovereignty for Indigenous communities? We encourage you to learn about the history of the land you are in relationship with by visiting 2 links that Tiara is going to throw into the chat. You're also invited to read the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario's land acknowledgement and learn more about what actions my organization is taking in terms of anti-racism, equity, and reconciliation at 2 links that Tiara is also going to drop into the chat, but efao.ca will get you there as well. If you have any thoughts or feedback, we are always interested in hearing from you and learning more as we take concrete actions towards these desires. So, one of the strengths of the seed community that we hear again and again is how incredible it is that presenters and participants like yourselves that gather together are so open in their knowledge and are honest with their personal seed stories. And with this in mind, I want to mention that the goal for this event is to create a safer space, a reminder that we are aiming to cultivate a learning-oriented community here in this space, and a culture that is kind and patient and respectful and open and curious and inclusive, In order to achieve this, we have a list of agreements that we like to follow. Some that might be particularly important today are to be curious and open and respectful, to remember that no one knows everything, but together we certainly know a lot on this call. We are doing our best, mistakes may happen, critique ideas and not people, avoid excessive jargon, acronyms, and industry language, which is definitely something that I can do when I start talking about seeds. And I think one that's not on this list, but I want to borrow from the Organic Seed Alliance conference that happened last month, is aim for connection, not perfection. So again, please reach out if you have any concerns. You can always private message myself or Tiara. We love to, learn more about how we can make this a safer space for all of you. Now, how are we going to engage? Well, we love hearing about where you're calling from, your name. So please feel free to put that in the chat, introduce yourselves. You can also choose to have your video on and off, but do remember that this webinar is being recorded. If you're comfortable, you can feel free to change your name. And we do ask that you stay muted when you're not speaking. And Tiara and myself as hosts will make sure that happens as well. If you have a question, there are two ways you can do this. You can first type it into the chat, and you can find that chat button on your Zoom toolbar, and we'll read your name along with your question. If there's time for all of them, if you want to ask a question privately, you can always send Tiara or I a private chat, and we'll put it into the queue of questions. And second, you can also raise your hand and ask questions over video or audio. And to do this, you need to go to your action button and then find the raised hand button. And this will indicate to Tiara or I that you have a question. And when your question is up, we'll ask you to unmute yourself, and you can do so to the presenters directly. If you're ever having technical difficulties, sometimes turning off your video helps. And if you're still having trouble, feel free to message us, and we'll see if we can help. But I'm so excited to welcome you again to our webinar on flower seed production. My name again is Rebecca Ironoff, and I'm the program manager, seed program manager at the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, where I implement the work of the Bauta initiative here in Ontario. Our technical host and someone who will be very happy to answer questions is my dear colleague, Tiara Stokes from Organic Alberta. She's waving to you there in the video. And I can see that we have 113 participants joining us live today. So welcome, and welcome to those who will be listening to the recording as well. So through our work to increase the quality, quantity, and diversity of ecological seed grown in Canada, the Bauta initiative staff have noticed that over the last few years, the flower production is becoming just incredibly popular among the diversified farmers with whom we work. And growers have pointed out to me that producing ecological flower seed on farm has many benefits. Flowers are part of climate resilient farming system. They provide food for pollinators, they provide habitat for beneficial insects, they increase biodiversity on your farm, they provide another revenue stream for your farm, and they're beautiful. When I was going through the registration questions, and I ran across this one that I just thought was so beautiful. It said, flowers are so important, I've discovered, for pollinators, edible parts, and because it draws people into the circle with beauty. And as my colleague Caitlin reminded me this morning, here at the Bauta Initiative, we are interested in supporting conversations about how flower seed fits into ecological agriculture and seeing how these conversations bloom. And I have to say, really, a 350-person registration sort of speaks for itself. So today's panel of experienced flower seed producers will share knowledge on how to grow ecological flower seeds successfully. This webinar is not targeted to beginner seed savers, but those who are new to seed saving will learn a lot along the way. For those brand new to seed saving, Tara is going to throw into the chat some resources that you can view afterwards. And now I'm so pleased to introduce our moderator for this session. So Clara Qualizza, the Chief Flower Farmer and Soil Tender at Meadow and Thicket Farm Flowers. She has a background in soil and agriculture and environmental science. Our panelists today include Dan Brisebois. He's one of the farmers at Tourne-Sol Co-operative Farm. Tourne-Sol produces certified seeds for an online seed store and a wholesale wrap program and grows vegetables for 500 weekly veggie baskets. Dan also runs the Farmer Spreadsheet Academy to help farmers learn tools and tricks to make better farm managers. I can speak. And in his spare time, Dan also blogs about seeds at goingtoseed.net. And Eric Budzynski is a seed production manager at a family-run flower farm and seed company, specializing in unique and uncommon and heirloom flowers in Washington. I like to say that Eric has a little bit of Canadian in him because he graduated from the University of British Columbia, where he studies focused on land, food, and community. Currently, Eric helps guide the planting and roguing and harvesting and cleaning of seed crops. He's also worked at Wild Garden Seeds and Uprising Seeds. And Stacey, who I hope has been able to join us. Stacey is the flower florist at Flora, and she grows commercial cut flowers and flower seed while raising many other things like fruits and vegetables and herbs for home use with her high school age daughter on their small homestead in Williams, Oregon. She is embarking on her 14th season of focusing specifically on flowers and stewards over 200 varieties of flowers and foliage plants. And yes, I'm just so grateful that you guys are here today, joining us and willing to share your wisdom about flower seed production. And with that, Clara, I'm gonna pass it over to you to situate yourself and your flower work.
All right, well, thank you ever so much, Rebecca. I'm Clara, and I grow flowers on less than an acre in Canadian Zone 2A, west of the city of Edmonton on Treaty 6 land. Well, I try to grow flowers. I'm kind of in awe to be in the presence of these speakers today, and I too am absolutely gobsmacked and privileged to be here today and really looking forward to it. So I'll just turn it next on to Dan.
Hello. So I'm going to share my screen. So I'm Dan Brisebois from Tourne-Sol Co-operative Farm. And so I'm part of Tourne-Sol Co-operative Farm. We started in the fall of 2004 and have been running ever since. We began as a worker co-op with 5 members. At this point, we're 7 members and we have about 14 non-members, about 20 people total. And the non-members have that option to become new members as they wish. So it's a group so it's a farm that's really based on collaboration and working together and creating a sustainable model. And we're situated in Les Cèdres, Quebec, a bit west of Montreal. And I have a seed hat today, but we're market growers also, or actually CSA growers. So we have 6 to 7 acres of production in vegetables that feed 500 weekly CSA baskets. And then we also have an acre or so in seed production that we use to grow seed. At this point, the seed sales have actually become larger than the vegetable sales, but that wasn't always the case. And so we sell seeds predominantly through small packs at this point. At one point, we really were doing a lot more bulk seed, but now we really are almost only doing small packs. We have an online store, though we don't ship to the US, unfortunately, if anybody's US here. And we also have a retail seed rack program that has really grown. We're in over 150 stores now, mostly through Quebec, but also across Canada. And my other hat is the Farmer Spreadsheet Academy. And almost every presentation I do, I bring in a spreadsheet, and I don't actually have one for this one. So I thought I would share one from a previous presentation that if you go to spreadsheet.farm/FSA057, you can get a spreadsheet I shared recently it's about seed yields. And so these are seed yields that are kind of approximate for based on our farm. But there's a number of flower seed yields in there. And there's a place where you can write your email if you want to get an email newsletter from me, but you don't have to sign up from that. You can just click and get the spreadsheet, and nobody knows that you got it, and that's fine. So enjoy that. And I forgot I had this in here. My other big news, which scares me a little bit, is on April 27th, I am launching a podcast called the Seed Grower Podcast, and that's in collaboration with no-till growers. It's going to be awesome. So stay tuned. And I'll pass it on to, I guess, Eric.
Mm-hmm. That would be great.
Hello, yeah, I'm Eric Budzynski. I am the seed production manager at Floret Flowers in Washington State in the Skagit Valley. And you'll have to excuse me if there is a jet that flies over. We're in the Naval Air Force fly zone, and one just flew over while Dan was speaking, so it was perfect timing, but it's incredibly loud. So I'm up at Floret. We do mostly research and education and some plant breeding and a lot of seed production. So we focus on zinnias and celosia. And personally, I've been growing seed for about 12 years, coming from mostly vegetable seed production, wild garden seed in Corvallis, Oregon, and uprising seeds up near Bellingham, Washington. And now I've been here about 2 years focusing on flower seeds. I've grown a pretty wide diversity of flower seeds and harvested and cleaned and kind of dug into all the intricacies of that, but then really focused on zinnias and celosia. So that's the core of what we do and what we're learning the most about. That's me.
Thanks so much, Eric. I just wanted to see if perhaps Stacey, Denton, you had signed in under a different name. I will continue to reach out, but feel free to message me if you're here. Otherwise, I'll pass it back to you, Clara, and perhaps we can move on to the section with Dan.
Yep, sounds good. If Stacey jumps in, we will absolutely get her to tell us a bit more about where she's located and what she's doing. But I'm not going to take up any more airtime because I'm super excited to hear from Dan about his experience with flower seed production. Sir, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. And one thing, before I jump in, I'm kind of looking through the participants' names, and it's just so awesome, all the people that are here. There's so many people I love, so many friends on this. It's nice to have this virtual option to do this, but it'd be great to be doing this in person also. But it's really fun to see so many people part of this conversation. I look forward to hearing the questions later on. So today we're talking about flower seed production. And what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to start talking about a little bit about field layout to avoid cross-pollination. I talk about crop rotation, and a few notes about climate, because we're growing in a northern climate which has short and wet, and so some of the challenges that creates for flower seeds. And then I'm going to wrap up by talking about 3 easy flower seed crops. So in some ways, I'm the beginner guy here on this panel. And here we go. So starting off with field layout. And this is a picture of our farm from the top. And we have 17 acres that are broken up into these growing blocks that are more or less the size of the yellow rectangle you see there. So we have about 24 of those. They're half an acre wide, or half an acre in size. And our farm is, so our challenge is that we're mixing in vegetable production with seed production. And in this specific case, the pink square or rectangle and the yellow rectangle, these are our main seed production areas. And they're about 1,500 feet apart. And with most crops, we're able to grow a variety in each block without them cross-pollinating, in terms of crops that are predominantly cross-pollinating. And so this is kind of how we're doing it on a bigger scale. We also have an area in green that we specialized in just putting flowers in that area. And there's one of the things with flowers, so, I mean, all seed crops to an extent are flower crops because they put up flowers and then you get seeds off of them. But a lot of them are ready at one time, and then you can harvest it, and then your field is clear, and either you can go into a cover crop, or else you could plant some other vegetable crop or something else. But a lot of flowers, you just keep producing, and you're able to get a harvest over a much longer period. And so that yellow and purple block, we tend to have more our basic seed crops there, and then we try to keep the flowers as much as possible in the green block so that they're able to be in the ground longer. Now, one of the challenges that we have is that we also grow cut flowers as a crop for our CSA. So we have a CSA share. And so we grow those cut flowers in that purple block. So we have to be a little strategic in what crops we might put in the green block to avoid cross-pollination. So that's kind of how we're managing it on our farm. Now, a really important question, if you're going to wonder about, if you're worried about cross-pollination, is why are you growing seed? Because cross-pollination can mean different things to you or have a different impact on the way you answer that. So if you're going to sell seed, and if you're selling seed under a named variety, it's fairly important. So you need to respect isolation distances. And for a lot of flowers and most vegetables, that like something like 1,000 to 1,500 feet, we'll probably keep them true to type. Especially if you have a lot of flowering crops in your area, that's going to distract your pollinators from crossing in that area. Now, I would say there's a little bit, maybe more flexibility for a little bit less true to typeness in flowers, just because they're not necessarily something that's going to be eaten, but that always depends on your market. Now, if you're preserving a variety, if you have a variety that's an heirloom for your family, or it's, it's part of your community or culturally significant for whatever reason, that's also really important to respect isolation distances, because you can change the story of that crop pretty quickly with one year. So that's something to note. But in many cases, if what you're trying to do is grow pretty things for people, yourself and others, isolation distance isn't as important. Now, things will cross up, and if you really want to only have a certain flower in a certain color, then maybe pay a little bit more attention. But most crosses you're going to get in your flowers are going to be really beautiful, and they're going to be really stunning. And not all of them will be stunning. Some of them will be stunning. And then that gives you an opportunity to save seed from that and try to recreate it in the future. And I think that that's one thing, that saving seed on your own farm for your own use. It's really fun to push the limits of cross-pollination and explore that. So that's what I would tell you about isolation distances. Now, for crop rotation, I'm going to start talking about seed, the way that I look at crop rotation for all seed crops, not just flowers, and then I'll talk about how flowers fit into that. And so one of the challenges with seed production is that you wind up with a lot of seed that you might not harvest, and that shatters and falls on the ground. And the year after a seed crop, even if you've harvested most of it, the year after a seed crop, it can really cause a lot of weed problems. And if you're growing on bare soil and you're growing something like carrots or beets or something that's direct seeded, it's going to irritate you. If you're growing on landscape fabric or growing on plastic, it might not be the same issue. But if you are growing on bare soil and you want to avoid having seeds sprouting the next year, it's really great to alternate a year of seed production with a year of cover crop. And so that creates kind of 1 year seed production, 1 year cover crop, year seed production, cover crop. Now, the way that I like to manage seed production in rotation is divide the crops by whether they're frost tolerant or not. So the crops that can resist the frost, I'll place in one area, and these will be crops that in our area, we're going to plant around May 1st. And then crops that can't take any frost, we're going to put in another area, and we're going to plant them around June 1st. And so in year 1, if you have 4 blocks, it looks like this. In year 2, you can see we just move over every block by 1. Year 3, same thing. Year 4. And this means that the crops that are in 1 block won't come back until 4 years later. So it creates a 1 in 4 rotation, which for a lot of diseases is pretty good. There are some diseases that's not great. And what's interesting about dividing into frost hardy and frost tender is that mostly this goes along family lines. And so crop families that are resistant to frost, well, almost all the crops tend to be in the same families. And there's a couple that's not totally true, but it's true for most of the cases. Now, there's one thing about rotation to be aware of with flower seeds is the Asteraceae family. So this is the family that includes stuff like zinnias, sunflowers, but also includes lettuces, chicories. It's not most, but it feels like half of the flowers in a cut flower garden will be in this family. And these so there's some crop families that seem so resistant to disease, and you could grow them year after year and it's not a problem. That's not the case with Asteraceae. There's so many white molds and gray molds and all kinds of things just waiting for these crops to make these crops disintegrate and turn to jelly. And so this is the one crop, this is the one family that I would really be aware of in your rotation, and making sure that you're getting it to come back not more than once every 4 years or so, and to be aware that stuff like lettuce is in that same family if you're balancing the vegetable and flower world. And probably plan your, if you're really going heavy into flower seed, plan your rotations around your Asteraceae. And so back in the picture that I had showed with that purple block of our farm, where we have our cut flower production, because it's in the same rotations of our seed crops, we actually don't save any Asteraceae seeds in that area. We save them elsewhere because we don't want them to be in that quick rotation. And actually, we also, maybe I should, I don't have a slide for that, but we actually don't do a lot of seed production in our cut flower production areas because we harvest those pretty heavily. Though I do walk through them continuously, one, because they're beautiful, but also I'm always looking for something unexpected, either a variety that's being trialed that I didn't know, or something that pops up from cross-pollination, because some of the seed that we're using will have populations that, there'll be an individual I suddenly see there and we'll flag it and keep it. But those areas we're not intending to harvest for seed except for stuff that's flagged. And it's all other dedicated areas that will be in seed. So a few notes about climate. So in Quebec, where I farm, we have a short season, and then it's a really hot season in the middle of the summer. So things do mature fairly quickly once they get going. But it's also a climate that can be sometimes really cold and can sometimes be really, really wet. And even in years that is not wet, there's a lot of ambient humidity. So there's a lot more disease that spreads than you might have in a drier climate. And you don't know in advance whether it's going to be an extremely wet year or just a slightly wet year. And if you're just growing a bit of flower seed for your own production, that might not matter much because you can probably get more than enough seed for yourself from a few plants. But if you're trying to get bulk seed to sell, or you really need a lot of seed for some reason, climate will cause a problem. And especially with more naked seeded crops. And so this isn't a picture, this is a picture of kale in flower. We don't actually grow a lot of flowers continuously in the greenhouse. We tend to use it for other systems, for other crops. But growing crops under plastic, like under a caterpillar tunnel or a greenhouse, for crops that you really want to get a reliable yield, will help beat the climate. And it's it's something that you have to balance the cost of using that space versus using it for something else. But you can get really high quality seed out of a greenhouse. And you can also get a fair amount of blooms that you would be using beforehand that you then let the rest, not deadhead them, but let them go to seed, and then you can harvest it and you can save that seed. So it can be an extra value from the same space. And also growing in a greenhouse lets you plant way earlier than you could if you're growing in a climate like ours where we can't get out into May. And it lets us grow longer in the fall and lets things mature to a later time in a period that would normally be pretty wet. So I'm going to wrap up with some easy flower seed crops. Excuse me. And the reason I call them easy is that they're just almost trying to give you the seed. They don't really require a lot more coaxing. And so the first one I'm going to talk about are straw flowers. And so straw flowers, if you, and so what's nice, if this was a vegetable seed production, there's like so many extra steps, but as a flower seed production, basically you plant them and you let them go. And then you basically don't harvest all of them and you'll get some seed. So that's kind of the general flower rule. Now, one thing to note, if you're going to be growing flower seed, growing a crop to seed, is that you still have to plant early enough so that you can get to the bloom, and that from the bloom, you're going to still be able to get to the seed afterwards, because it can take 1 to 2 months to do that. Now, it's not true for all seeds, but a lot of them will take longer. So you want to get those crops in as early as possible so that they will produce a good seed set. So these are some straw flowers, and you can see on the right, there's some that are just starting to mature. On the back, on the top left are some that are almost ready. And at that point, you start to be tempted. But when the seed is really ready, it looks like the bottom right. And it's just this fluffy stuff just falling off, and it makes it very appealing to children. And if you go and take with your hands, you can kind of rub those fuzzies off, and then you have just a pile of seed on this little plate. And it's fairly easy to separate this with a screen and maybe winnow off some of the fluff. It's light seed, so winnow carefully, but it's not particularly difficult to get that seed. It's a really clear indicator and a really clear extraction afterwards. The next that I'll show, and I don't have as many pictures, though I've grown a lot of poppies, is poppies. And there's a number of species, and the different species don't cross together, though within a species, they can cross together. These are Papaver somniferium, like an annual poppy, and there's a lot of different variety out there. One thing that I have found extremely frustrating is how little they do cross. So you can see this is a population that I've been trying to cross up, and I'll grow them side by side, which is what I tend to do with a lot of cross-pollinating varieties, and let them cross, let the bees and the other pollinators go between them, and then I'll keep the seed separately, and I'll sow a row out and look for something different. And with poppies, it's a really low amount of crossing, even though it's such a showy flower. Now, poppies poppies need to go in really early, one way or the other. They produce a really clear, really distinct bulb, or not bulb, what do you call it? Like a seed head, and that you can crack open, and there's a bunch of seed in it that's, sometimes you can shake it out, but using it often like a window screen, so like a really tight mesh, that can be enough to let the seed separate through and get it really quickly. And then the last flower I'm going to mention is Nigella. So there are a number of species. This is I think it's some Kalanji, which is like, I don't remember the species, but like a black cumin. But there's a number of different Nigella species. Often the varieties will be called Love in the Mist, even though they're different species, and they don't cross within each other, and they're very distinct looking. Now, I don't know how much crossing happens within an actual species, because I've been maintaining dependent varieties, but Nigella produces these nice big bulbs, and you can shake the seed out pretty easily, or just crush it and get that seed. And so these are varieties that are really easy to harvest a lot of seed without a lot of extra work compared to some other flowers. So thank you so much for listening through this. And this is my last slide, but if you want to stay in touch, I do have, so there's the FSA 057 spreadsheet that I mentioned. I do also have a list of seed resources at spreadsheet.farm/seeds. If you're interested, again, you don't have to sign up to the emails newsletter. You can just get that list. And I'm on Instagram under my own account as Spreadsheet Maniac, where I write about seeds and spreadsheets and farming. And Tourne-Sol is where we write up, is where our farm has an Instagram account. So thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Dan. That was fabulous. I really appreciated your comments about being willing to explore, but also respect the, possibly the rights of some breeders, but also to be really curious about what might come out of your field, and also about your details about Asteraceae and rotations. That had never occurred to me. I'm wondering, we will be taking the audience's questions at the end of our meeting today, but I'm wondering, Eric, if you had any supplementary comments to make in response to Dan's fabulous talk there.
Yeah,
and there's Stacey. Sorry.
That's okay. I also wanted to just second what Dan was talking about with the with isolations, especially if you're growing something that's not a commercial seed crop or like a named variety, or if it's a named variety but you're doing it at home, like experiment with the isolations and see what works and what doesn't, because there's a lot of information out there that is maybe not exactly correct or misinformation in isolation distances, like the published isolation distances. And the poppies, for example, I have also noticed that those, especially the fully doubled flowers, mostly self-pollinate. And that's something that I haven't really seen in literature. So experiment and document. And there's a lot to learn in isolation distances and flowers. The other thing I wanted to say with those are three great examples of like really easy crops, really great crops, like such a pleasure to grow and to clean. And with the poppies, I love how freely they give their seed. And I've always thought it would be cool to just take one of those poppy seed heads and at a restaurant, like just serve the poppy seed head on, people can put their own poppy seeds on the plate. It's just a funny side note. If there's any chefs out there, there's a good idea for you.
That's brilliant. Although with some of them, there might be some distribution constraints. Stacey, it's so good to see you. I don't know if you caught all of Dan's fabulous talk, or if you have any comments that you want to make at this point in the game.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Stacey. Sorry to be a little bit late, and I actually didn't catch all of what Dan said, but I'll just offer up this in the hopes that it hasn't been said. I, as a farmer florist, do a lot of isolations over time, so by way of succession planting. So for me, I do things like grow 2 to 3 waves of cosmos or 4 to 5 waves of sunflower, and usually I'll, because of the climate that I live in, I can pull off early crops for cutting and then do later successions just for seed. So that's one way that I do isolation planning with what I grow in the field to serve both purposes of cutting and growing seed. And then another little fun thing that I've done is with Scabiosa atropurpurea. I have a lot of different colors that I work with in my design work, but I've grown seed of the Black Knight. And so what I've done is I've allowed my Scabiosa that's overwintered to go to flower, and it flowers early. And then my Scabiosa that I planted in the same year, in the spring that is, that's the crop that I've saved for seed. So when it starts to come into flower, the overwintered Scabiosa is just finishing. I can go through and cut off any blooms that remain on that first wave that it overwintered, and then in that way isolate my my second wave that got spring planted for a seed crop. So that might be interesting to people to think about doing little things like that.
Absolutely.
One more note, if I can jump in again, Dan was talking a little bit about growing in houses, and we do quite a bit of that because we have a bunch of varieties of the same species that we're growing in a small area. And so I just wanted to just touch a little bit on pollination in that. And one thing that we do that's been really successful is blue bottle flies on zinnias and on celosia, and as well as bumblebees. So bumblebees are used in like tomato and pepper greenhouse production, and honeybees are not good for growing inside. They don't like it. They get all agitated, understandably. But bumblebees, they love it. They do well. They're excellent pollinators. And the hives, bumblebee hives, just naturally don't go through the winter. All of them die, except the queen. So it's not as big of a commitment as like maintaining a honeybee hive. So those are both two pollination options we've used for indoor and had pretty good success with both of them. There is a little bit to learn with that, like bumblebees won't pollinate everything, flies won't pollinate everything, but the combination of the two does a pretty good job.
Brilliant.
And so are you growing in screened greenhouses so that you have different isolations, have more breeding area or more like variety maintenance? Is that what you're doing?
That's right. Yeah.
So so in our case, we grow without screens, and that means pollinators can come in, but they can also cross pollinate. So that's actually, so if we wanted to do that, we would have to follow what you just mentioned.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for those supplementary comments and for clarifying some of that. So much to think of. I'm going to keep us rolling along here with presentations. And Eric, can I turn it over to you now?
You can. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of start out where you're starting to ask the question, like, when do I harvest this? So Dan was right, where you pretty much, other than figuring out the isolations, you pretty much grow it as a normal crop and just keep it alive and happy until the point when you ask that question, when do I harvest this? So I'm going to talk a little bit about harvesting, and I'll focus on zinnias and celosia, on drying, on threshing, and a little bit on cleaning as well. All of these topics are huge, but I'm gonna try to get some good points in there. So when we're doing zinnia harvests, we like to harvest when the heads are completely dry. And most ideally if the stem right below the head is dry. And at that point, the seed head isn't getting any more help from the mother plant. So you can clip that. We store them in Rubbermaid bins. We just go through the field with Rubbermaid bins, clipping heads and throwing them in. And one thing to keep in mind with zinnia, but other things too, with zinnia, we don't like to clip like a lot of stem. Just clip it right under the head. If you have all that stem, when you thresh it later, you're going to break that stem into a million pieces, and it's really hard to clean out. So that's an important thing, is learning, and sometimes you have to learn the hard way, but figuring out what you can do to prevent chaff from getting in the seed like as early as possible. So that goes for like keeping your fields weeded, because that weed seed will get in your final seed. So just keep it out of there in the first place. So for zinnia, we harvest when the heads are brown. For things like celosia, that doesn't ripen all at the same time. Even the flowers on one stem won't ripen at the same time. So for that, we like to wait until the bottom seed pods are popping open. They have these little capsules on the seed pods. And when the seeds ripen, they turn shiny and black. That cap pops off. And that's kind of our visual cue for when to start cutting. If you cut right when you first notice the seeds ripening, the seeds that are up at the top of the flower stem aren't going to be ripe, and they're not going to after ripen. Some of them might. They might after ripen about halfway up, but the ones at the top aren't going to. So celosia is one that you might lose a little bit of the first seed by waiting, but if you wait until seed further up on the stem is ripe, then you're going to get the largest amount, the greatest amount of ripe seed overall. And what happens if you harvest too early? You might get a lot of seed that looks good and you think it might be good, but when you go to winnow it, you can have celosia seed that looks great and looks dark, it looks full. When you winnow it, it all blows out and you're left with just a small amount of good seed. So it really is beneficial to wait until you see seed ripening further up the stem. You don't have to wait for the seed to pop open further up the stem, but there's visual indicators like the capsule covering the seed pod, it's translucent and you can kind of see dark seed inside. So what we do is just go down the row looking for the flower branches where you can see that there's ripe seed all the way up the branch, snip those, put them in a bin, and then bring it back to the greenhouse. So when we go to dry both of those crops, there's a fabric that we use that we just call it seed fabric, but it's a spun poly fabric, I think, and it's sold as a landscape weed barrier. So something that you would put under mulch or put under wood chips, or I think they use it in the construction of roads as well to prevent things from coming up, but it allows moisture to go through, water goes through it, air can pass through it, but seeds can't. It's beautiful. You can get it at hardware stores. It's also a huge pain because after a while the spun fabric kind of shreds, but it's worth it. It's one of the best things to use to dry seeds on. And we'll roll that out on a greenhouse table. We'd use our propagation tables in the fall. We're not starting anything, so we just put them right up on the table, that seed fabric, the spun poly fabric, and lay celosia heads out there, lay zinnia heads, and with a fan moving over it in a hot greenhouse, that it can dry in a matter of a couple days. Some things take up to a week, but it dries pretty quickly. And even with the good air circulation of using that seed fabric, you still need to flip things over after a couple days or halfway through the drying process, just to make sure the bottom dries out as well. And we have done it other ways. We've done it on the ground, on tarps, in a greenhouse, and that does work. It's fine. It doesn't dry as quickly. Totally works though. You do have to pay a little bit more attention because the tarps don't let moisture pass through, and they actually build up moisture. There's a lot of condensation with tarps, so you have to rotate them more frequently. We've also dried seed outdoors on tarps and outdoors on that seed fabric. And in our summers, we don't really get rain in the summertime. So in late August, September, we can be drying things outside, sometimes in October even. And if we use that spun seed fabric, it comes in lengths. They're like 4 or 6 feet wide by 50 or 100 feet long. You can roll them out, lay seed out in the sun to dry, lay flower heads, not the clean seed, but flower heads. If you have a rain in the forecast, you can roll that up in a nice little like Swiss roll cake or burrito, and that will actually shed most of the moisture. And if it's like a week of rain that's coming, you'd want to pull it inside, but like a brief shower, you can protect seed that way. So that's mostly how we dry things. And when we go to thresh, there are some things that like to be threshed really crispy dry, and some things that you want to fully dry them before you thresh them, but then it might be beneficial to wait until the morning or a cloudy day when it has reabsorbed some moisture. So things like tiny sticks, or in the case of zinnias, like the cone that all of the seed is attached to. When you break apart a zinnia seed head, there's a cone that all the seed is attached to. If that breaks open, it is almost impossible to get out, except if you pick it out by hand. So for zinnia, we like to get it totally dry so that all the seed has matured, but then let it reabsorb some moisture or thresh it in the morning, so that we're not breaking up that cone. And I think a lot of seeds have little tricks like that. Some things you want it to be like as dry as possible, like sunflowers, get them as dry as possible so that when you hit it with a stick or stomp on it or however you thresh it, all the seeds just shatter out as easily as possible. But there's some things that you might want to thresh like rather wet. I guess that brings me to threshing. There's three main ways that we do it here. We do a lot of threshing by foot, actually, and you can thresh a lot of seed by foot and with a stick. And that's how we initially did zinnia seed. Like I was just saying, drying it, letting it absorb some of the humidity, but then lay it out on a clean tarp, step on it with your feet. They pop open pretty easily. The seed pops off the cone pretty easily. And I would just start on one side of the tarp and work my way across, just kind of like chicken scratch stepping, and just being careful not to break that cone. But you can, when you're doing it by foot, there's a lot of control over how much pressure you put. So you can feel if you're putting too much pressure on it, or you can, lighten up and just kind of roll the seed head, like that kind of motion, roll it, and the seeds just roll right off of it and you don't break up that cone. Another way that we thresh some seed is with a truck or a tractor. This is good if you have a lot more of a crop. Like we do this for sweet rocket and we do it for silene, things that we have. We're cutting it all at once. It all needs to be threshed at once. It's big and the seeds are relatively small. If you try this with large seeded things like beans, some peas, some of them split if you drive over them. So things to think of are, if you're going to thresh with a car, doing it on a soft surface like grass rather than gravel or concrete. But what we do is lay them out on a clean tarp and just drive over it back and forth with relatively clean tires. You wouldn't want to drive in the mud and then do this. But it's very effective. It threshes pretty fully, and you can always go afterward and check with a stick, with your hands, make sure that everything is threshed. But that's a fast way to do things. And then we also do some mechanical threshing. We have used a hammer mill, and in past seed work, I've used a hammer mill in the form of what is called a chipper shredder. It's a leaf shredder. It's essentially a hammer mill. Really, really great tool for a lot of seed crops. In the vegetable world, I've used it for hot chilies, peppers, chicories, cardoons, things like that. In the flower world, we've used it for sunflowers, and we started experimenting on zinnias. Actually works pretty well. We have an electric motor where we're able to turn the speed way down because you don't want to make flour, which does have the capacity to do. So if you're using something like that, you want to bring the speed way down, and you can thresh pretty effectively with that. We did most of our zinnias that way this year, and they came out pretty clean, a lot cleaner than doing by foot in most cases. So if you have access to a hammer mill, or I feel like in grain producing regions, they're just around, you can find one, or a leaf shredder can be highly effective. Then also some people use a vacuum, and like a shop vacuum. These are really useful tools in seed cleaning, seed threshing. There's a grower that I know that does all of their zinnias, threshing all of their zinnias with a vacuum, just one at a time, dropping flowers down the vacuum tube. And it might take a little bit of time up front, but you're not going to shatter the cone. And so the cleaning time will actually be saved like pretty drastically. And it will thresh the petals off of that are attached to the seed. It will thresh those off. So that's a great option. We, side note, have also used that for harvesting marigolds, which is an interesting thing. You can just kind of suck them right out of they're kind of sitting in a cup. The seeds just kind of stuck in a cup, and you can just suck it right out with a vacuum. And that brings us to cleaning, which is a huge topic. Do I still have time? I noticed that I'm a little bit over.
We are definitely running beyond our schedule, but I think if you mention the next step quickly, then perhaps we can, we can do that.
So I was going to do just a very brief intro into cleaning anyway. It's a huge topic, but basically what we do is rough screen in the field with like a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch screen, something that takes just the biggest branches, the biggest leaves, and all the seed easily falls through. And a rough winnow just to take out the lightest material and just really making sure that all of your seed falls right into the bin. And after that, it's just a series of screening, then winnowing, then screening, then winnowing, then screening, then winnowing. It's really important to have a full array of screen sizes because you use different ones in different years, even for the same seed. So having that option at your fingertips is really great. And another just quick note on it, especially in flower seeds, especially because so many are composite family, there tends to be different seed sizes, different seed shapes altogether with composites. So it's useful when you're cleaning them, especially for winnowing, it's useful to separate out the sizes or separate out the shapes. So in zinnias, the ray seed, that is the outer seed that's attached to the flower petals, is going to be very different from the inner seed, the disc seed, which comes from the florets. So when cleaning those, there's a screen size that you can separate those two out. So then when you're winnowing, you're not blowing out a bunch of good seed just because it's smaller or bigger or vice versa. I think I'll stop it at that.
Thanks so much, Eric. My goodness. Astounding amount of things to think about, but such innovative ideas for dealing with the huge range of seed types that we know we have in the flower world. I'm wondering, Stacey or Dan, did you have anything to follow on with what Eric was speaking about? And if not, that's okay. We can just keep going along with Stacey, but just thought I'd let you have the opportunity if something tweaked your synapses.
I love landscape fabric also, and we have a lot of area like landscape pieces, fabric pieces that are the same width as our greenhouse beds. That's kind of it's too wet for us to harvest and lay them outside, as you mentioned, but we'll harvest onto pieces that are like 10 or 15 foot long, and then we'll kind of fold them in half or maybe roll them a little bit, and then put them on the wagon and then bring them into the greenhouse. So not necessarily if we're doing like seed heads, but if we were doing whole plants, we would do that. I love the idea of cleaning seed with shop vac. We do it with squash seed, but I've been hearing a lot more about doing with flower seeds, and I'm really curious. That's something I'm really, really curious about.
Brilliant.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I think there's so much, like Eric said, that could be brought up on this topic. I am always trying new flower seeds, and there's just such a broad range of flower seed shapes and sizes. because they span so many plant families. And so I think just on the most basic level, it's really important to get good at identifying what is the seed. And I might have missed this being said already, but I do a lot of asking myself that question. And really the indicators that I find most helpful are color and density. So if you're trying to grow a flower seed that's new to you, when you get to the part of the plant's life cycle where you're looking at, okay, what is it that I want to be collecting? I want to just give you that those tips of just looking at the color change in the seed. It usually gets darker in color, and then it also gets more dense. Sometimes it's hard to tell what's the seed and what's the rest of the flowering parts. Sure. In terms of seed readiness, I always really appreciate watching the birds in the field. And if you find that they're there, they're telling you, you better get out there before they get all your seed. So that's a really good natural indicator for seed readiness. And I wanted to comment on the topic of readiness also, because I grow a lot of perennial flower seed, and typically with perennial flower seed, the seed ripens in waves. So I've just learned over time what species ripen more quickly than others. So for example, this last year I grew Achillea millefolium, yarrow, Colorado mix, and the earlier harvest of that seed ended up being the better approach for me. Instead of taking it for cut flowers, I really needed to get those early flowers maturing seed, because the later waves did not finish out seed in my field. However, there's other perennials that likewise are maturing their seed in waves, but they may mature their seed faster. So back to my Scabiosa example, that's a seed pod that really goes from flower to, or that's a flower that goes from flower to seed very quickly, at least in my climate. So I have a little bit more wiggle room with that in terms of when I need to harvest it to have a viable seed crop. I'll just offer those things because probably there's lots more to say, but there's a couple.
Fabulous. Thanks, Stacey. So Stacey, we're going to move on to you right away. But if you could just kind of situate yourself, tell the folks where you're actually located for folks who don't already know where you're at, and then you roll with
great.
it.
So I'm Stacey Denton. I got a little confused with the time change. Sorry to be late. I just came in from the field. I'm in my overalls. I'm in Southern Oregon in zone 8B, if that really means too much anymore these days. It's quickly getting hotter and drier here. And I have a climate that typically is a 6-month rain, 6-month drought cycle. So it's a great region in the United States for seed ripening, because we almost always have very dry falls. And I've been growing seed commercially for 20 years, but have devoted myself in the last 14 years to specifically growing flower crops. And I'm a farmer and a florist. So I do flower growing, but I also do a lot of floral design work. And I'm in the process of certifying organic, although my practices have always been that way. And for the last 4 years, I worked for a small bioregional seed company called Siskiyou Seeds, and I curated the flower seed offerings there. I'm no longer doing that work, but I am still a flower seed grower for the company. And I thought I'd just bring that up because when I was working for Siskiyou Seeds, looking through the catalog of almost 800 different varieties offered between vegetables, herbs, and flowers, I noticed that there were 135 flower varieties that we offered. And of those flower varieties, the flowers pertain to 24 different plant families and 75 genera. In comparison, the number of vegetables in the catalog pertain to only 10 plant families and 23 genera. So I think that's a really good context for us as we talk about what flower seed is, because as a farmer florist, for example, I'm relying on not just your pretty disc flowers like zinnias or calendula or cosmos to do floral design work. I'm also relying on beautiful seed pods like Scabiosa or cress. And then I'm also relying on grains like millet and amaranth. And I'm also utilizing small filler flowers. So when I think of flowers and growing flower seed crops, I think of all of those categories because that is what I use as a farmer florist. And I think my job is to talk specifically about flower seed germination. And I put together a little chart. Thanks for prompting that. Here's my contact information for anyone that wants to jot it down. And if you could go to the next slide, please. Here's the beginning of the chart that I put together for y'all. And it's comprised of about 20 different varieties. And you'll see at the top what I consider the sort of gateway flower seed flowers. That is, I think, very easy flowers to grow. So the germination category there next to the flower type has my personal rating system on how easy I think it is to germinate these particular seeds. And I've included for you the temperature that they typically germinate at and the time period to get them to germinate. So I want to give a shout out to Johnny's because I definitely looked at their temperatures. I have an inner sense about these temperatures myself when I'm working in the greenhouse, but here they are for you in both Fahrenheit and Celsius. So yeah, I called zinnias, sunflowers, cosmos, marigolds, and calendula the kind of gateway flowers because they're easy to grow, and they aren't, as Eric got into, necessarily the most easy to clean with their threshing and winnowing. For example, zinnia is a little bit trickier. But I wanted to give you this spectrum of different flowers. If you proceed down the same slide, you'll see I've got amaranth in there, poppy, celosia, gomphrena, China aster. These are all flowers that I have grown for seed, and they're ones that are really common in my work too as a farmer florist. So I think as a contract seed grower, for those of you in the audience that are interested or already doing that work, these are crops that are pretty typically requested by seed companies for people to grow out lots of them. Myself on my farm, I grow almost 200 different varieties of flowers, and with that variety, I'm constantly learning new things about, as I was saying earlier, what the seed is and how to harvest it, how to thresh it, how to winnow it. But my task before you is really germination. So I think the chart largely speaks for itself. If you want to do a screenshot or take a photograph of those temperatures, this is, I think, just a really easy reference for you that you can utilize in the future. I thought I'd draw your attention now, as we are looking at that first slide, to some of my tips that I offer up in terms of germination. So once we get beyond those easy ones, well, let's look at poppy. I have rated this a little bit more challenging. I put it at the medium scale for myself to start, and that's because it's pretty slow to germinate in my experience. And it also really likes to be exposed to cold. So it does best. It doesn't absolutely have to be stratified, but it does best if it's either chilled beforehand in the refrigerator or overwintered in the field. And poppy is also a little bit tricky for those of you who have weedy fields like mine and don't necessarily want to direct seed your poppies. Poppies really do prefer to be direct seeded, but I have gotten around that a little bit myself by seeding them into soil blocks. So I use either the mini soil blocker or just the average size 12 unit blocker. And I seed like that in the greenhouse. And in my climate, I typically am seeding poppies either in the fall that way, or I do them in January. And then the next item on my list, the celosia, I also have it at that medium rating. And that's mostly because I find it to be pretty slow. The chart there says 8 to 14 days, but of course the temperatures listed in this chart are your ideal temperatures. And If you're starting things in an unheated greenhouse like I am, then you're not maintaining those ideal temperatures 24 hours a day. So that can elongate the time period for germination if you don't have that consistent temperature. So yeah, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, I've got a little bit more tips on this page. I want to just point out that at the top of this chart, there are listed a few samples of what we call cool season annuals. So bachelor's button, strawflower, sweet peas, bells of Ireland, larkspur, nigella, and cress are things that I would put all into that category. Those are all plants that I seeded here in, again, zone 8B in late January in my greenhouse or early February. And so I find the bachelor's button and strawflower pretty darn easy, but it gets a little bit more difficult, especially with that sweet pea. And I want to just point out to you that sweet pea is another one of those that can require patience on your part. And while there's some controversy about this, I think that I found the best way to grow sweet pea to start it is to nick the outer seed coat and then plant it that way, as opposed to soaking it. So that's just my personal experience, that just breaking through that hard seed coat with a little bit of sandpaper or a nail file and doing it opposite to the little scar that you see on the seed. That is a really good way to wake up that seed. And then of course, getting it into soil and deep pots and being patient. It can be something that you go the soaking route with as well, but there's a fair bit of dormant seed with sweet pea, seed that just doesn't want to wake up. And I find that to be more the case when I go the soaking method as opposed to the nicking method. So there's my little tip about sweet peas. And bells of Ireland can be a little bit tricky. In my climate, they do best if I overwinter them. So either seeding them in soil blocks or direct seeding them in the fall. And if you don't want to do that because it doesn't make sense for your climate, then doing a little bit of cold stratification. I usually just take the seed packet myself and tuck it into the refrigerator for a couple weeks, and that should do the trick. The same is true for larkspur. It likes to be cold stratified. It likes to be direct seeded, but you can, you can work around the direct seeding with larkspur too. I just recently seeded it into mini soil blocks, have bumped them up, and we'll be planting them out in my field in the next week or so. Nigella likes to be direct seeded. So most of the rest of the items on the list are pretty straightforward. Next slide, please. Okay, you guys, I'm not used to talking that much, so please excuse me. Having to drink some extra water. I thought I'd walk you through larkspur if there's enough time. How are we doing?
I think you can go through.
Okay, great.
We've decided we'll go a little longer, so.
I see.
Yeah.
All right, so larkspur is a seed crop that I've really enjoyed growing. This is a picture of some flowers from the Galilee mix, for those of you who know that. I find larkspur tends towards purple, so even in those mixes, the white and the pink are a little bit few and far between, but I accommodate for that by either reducing the number of purple stems that I collect seeds from, by actually pulling plants out, or in the process of harvesting seed. I make sure to collect more from the pink and white flowers so that my mix has a more even selection of the colors. I think I'm actually going to need a break.
Yeah, I was gonna ask Stacey, do you want a break, and then maybe we can.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, we can perhaps pick up on some of these topics in group discussion, but let you go last. Does that sound okay? Awesome.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering whether or not Eric and Dan, if you want to jump in and comment a little bit about, if you have any comments about the germination end of the business that Stacey's fabulous talk has prompted in your heads.
Before that, one thing I did want to pick up on was Stacey mentioned how many different species there are and families of flower seeds. And that's something that's really exciting as a seed grower, because it seems like all the vegetables are Brassica oleracea. Like, so the vegetables, you're always worrying about everything crossing up because they're all the same species. And it's really refreshing as a seed grower to add flower crops in, because you might have a few varieties of a species, but there's so many, they have so much more chances of not crossing. And again, once you get the asters out of there, the composites out of there, the rest, there's so many different species too, so it's easy to rotate them. So that's something that I like. I think with the on terms of germination, so without talking about stratification and that kind of stuff, I think often it's good to think of seeds in like, there's like sort of 3 groups, and I know it's broader than that, but there's those that like to be cold, kind of, and I think in terms of Celsius, but like 15 to 20 Celsius. There's those that like to be hot, so maybe like 30 Celsius during the day and 20 at night. And then there's those that like to be in between. And sometimes those in between can tolerate a bit more heat. So kind of knowing clearly what it is, you can have different areas for those 3 crops, as opposed to trying to managing it all in the same spot can make your life a lot easier. And if you're doing germ tests, it's also really great to know those separate things.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan.
I guess I just had a couple things. We use a germ chamber for some things, germination chamber for some things. So Stacey was talking about how like an unheated greenhouse, some of those times might be longer than those given times, like significantly longer. If you're using a germination chamber, like for us, for Celosia, we get germination in like 3 days. And then just like pull it out after it's germinated. But yeah, it's the same on the other end. If you have ideal conditions, it can be like a lot less than those germination times. And then also on sweet peas, so sometimes I like to nick and soak, and then right away you can see which ones are opening up, which one, even if it's just swelling, just plant those. And then the ones that aren't swelling, even after nicking, just forget about it.
On the germination chamber, it doesn't have to be complicated, but one thing that, I mean, we do on our farm is we have in our nursery, in our greenhouse, we have, we just created a table that has, plywood on the bottom, and then we put like a heating coil, and then we put like a couple inches of sand, and we built up the sides, and you can put trays stacked in, and then it's covered, and you got to make sure they're watered in. But we do keep that at a certain heat point. And once they start to germinate, as soon as they germinate, we take them out. So it is something that's like a really concentrated space that's easier to manage. You don't want them to go too long in there, but it is worth doing that.
Yeah, and even on the most low-tech side of things, I even will germinate things on my kitchen counter. So I have just a simple Ziploc bag. I have my little pieces of paper, and I have my spray bottle. And so I just germinated several hundred echinacea seeds in my 65 to 70 degree house over the last 5 days, and just put them right out into plug trays once they had germinated, and they're looking great.
Brilliant. Well, thank you guys very much. That's some seriously meaty information that you've all provided. And we do have some time for a couple questions. I just wanted to let folks know that I know we've got a bunch of questions out there, But I know that Rebecca and the Bauta staff are going to send out a bunch of resources. As you've seen, she's been posting some links and things in response to questions Rebecca and Tiara have. And I'm sure that when you re-listen to this webinar, you're going to hear answers to a bunch of the questions, because I heard a bunch of answers to the questions I already had. And then if not, please do feel free to reach out to your regional coordinator, and they will absolutely link you up with some answers. But let's just ask a couple questions here. So when you're doing seed production for sale, never, or even for your own production systems, planning how many seeds you need, like for me, knowing about germination percentages is a big deal for me to know whether or not I'm just a loser for growing seeds, or if the seed package I have or that I have saved myself is just, it's just got low germination percentage, either because of the year or whatever. So do you have any tips on germination testing for folks, and how you attribute a percentage to a package of seeds or something like that?
I would start off by, so some varieties just germinate less, or some species germinate less well than others. And it's good to, over time, you'll figure that out. And so I'll get back to the testing in a second. The species that are harder to germinate, we'll sow 2 or 3 seeds per cell in a greenhouse tray, so that at least one of them will germinate. And then we also sow, and we do this generally for almost everything, about 30% more than we need in the field. So there's a buffer, so we can choose, if they all germinate, we can choose the best plants to plant out. And if they don't all germinate, then with the combination of having, the thinned out plants and that buffer, will probably get us to where we got to go. And there might be some crops that we are really, really finicky, where we will then also open an open flat, that we just make some like a little trough, and then we we seed it thickly in there, and then once they germinate, we'll pot them out into cells. And then we always have a little bit extra before we compost that rest. So those are some ways to just manage space and that. In terms of testing, so the first thing is really knowing what temperature, and that chart that Stacey mentioned is a good one, but knowing what temperature range you're at is the first thing to know, because if you're testing at the wrong temperature, you just can't trust those results for some crops. And it can be that you put in a coffee filter that's humid, you put some seeds in there, 10, 20, 100, and then you could put them in a bag, and then you could take them out after a certain number of days and keep track of how many germinate, and it'll give you a real germination rate. But you don't necessarily need a real germination rate. What you can also do, this is for your own use, is if you have just a tray in your house, you could sow some in it and see if a bunch come out or just a little bit come out. And if a bunch come out, you can assume that it's a better germination. And if it's a little bit, then you're going to probably want to sow really dense or order more seed.
Yeah. Well, and that's always... That last recommendation is sometimes not possible, because as you know, huge demand for a lot of these flower seeds, and then by the time you find out, it's too late. But I guess you need to be organized ahead of time, and make sure you know about those things. I'm wondering if we could just also a question that came up with some of the questions that came in with registration was about, proprietary cultivars and collecting seed and propagating seed. I know nothing about this, so I'm just going to ask the question about how do you deal with that? Or do you you just kind of go, well, proprietary cultivar won't do it? Except for saving for folks who want to save for themselves, like if I happen to have a sweet pea, a Gwendolyn, and I want to save Gwendolyn, but if you're going to sell it, that's a different ball of wax.
Nobody wants to touch this one?
That's okay.
A little bit about it, but this is not my wheelhouse. So there's a few different ways that seeds can be protected. And so in terms of seeds, there can either be what's a PVP, so a plant variety protection on it, or there could be patents on it. And there sometimes can also be trademarks on it. And I don't know much about the trademarks. The PVP, there's a database, and I think if you do GRIN, if you type in GRIN PVP in a Google search engine, you'll find a place where you can look to see if there's a PVP on it. And they're issued, and I think they have like between a 15 and 20 year lifespan, that during that time you can't save and sell the seed. Now, the rules change there's also an international agreement called UPOV around that, and there's a relationship between that, and the rules change depending on where you are in the world. But in Canada, at least, you can do what they call brown bagging the seed, so you can save some PVP seed for your own use on your own farm.
Yeah. Okay.
During that period. The utility patents are a bit trickier, and I don't know how that works with flower seeds, but this is often patents that are on the specific traits that are in the variety, not necessarily genetic engineering, but just the specific way it's been bred, or not the way it's been bred, but what it looks like. And plants that are protected under those patents, you can't save the seed even for your own use. And you can get in a lot of trouble for selling that. And then when there's stuff that's trademarked, that I don't really understand how that works, because then you're getting into some other kind of consumer laws, I think. What can also be tricky with, I think there's other regulations that come into flowers sometimes because of the vegetative part of the plant, but I don't know very much about that.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think it's worth really doing the research to see if it's protected, if you're going to save the seed. If you're just going to use it for yourself, no one's probably going to bust you. If you're a small seed company, no one will probably bust you in the short term. I mean, at one point, some people are going to want to go and chase down folks. But if you're going to become a bigger company, you're going to have to clean that up. But that's in terms of like really legal framework that you have to live within. There also is a whole aspect that seeds have histories and they come from places. And some of that is small breeders that are developing varieties nowadays. Some of it, they're coming from indigenous groups or other community groups. And so there can be bigger questions that come into, you might have the legal right to save the seed, but do you have a responsibility associated with that? And I'm not going to try to answer that. That's a big question, but there is a part that, in the case specifically of a lot of seed companies, when they're saving seed, or if they're going to offer a variety from something that was developed by a smaller breeder, even though they don't have to legally do it, they will get into a relationship with the company to offer royalties or some sign of payback to recognize the work that's done, because this is a very small community, and these are friends and neighbors, and it's a good way to encourage people to keep doing that work and to not have bitterness in there. So that's I guess maybe a last part is, if you are selling seed and you get seed that you don't know what it is, you might want to figure out what it is before you start selling it, because it might be something that's patented or otherwise, and you don't know that as you're getting into it. Just because you change the name doesn't mean that it's not what it is.
Absolutely.
And I just want to jump in really quick with one short point on that, and I agree with what Dan was talking about. But the PVPs, you can research that. You can read the PVPs. It's really fascinating. Utility patents, it's very hard to find what is utility patented and what isn't. It's next to impossible. It's a very complicated issue. I just wanted to make that note. PVP, a lot of seed companies will even say, but you can search it. It's available. Utility patents, it's dark.
Okay. Great. No, thank you very much, both of you. And I know Rebecca's posted a link, and will, as I said earlier, we'll circulate the available links for these topics, but really appreciate that conversation, and clearly something that we could talk about for a lot longer. Maybe just as our last question for the day, it's for each of you. Do you have one absolutely fabulous resource, book, article, place that you would recommend for folks, that was invaluable for you when you first started and that is valuable for you now? Maybe Stacey. Oh, I know I'm popping that on you and not letting you have time to think, but I
That's
bet
okay.
you have the answer.
Well, I really like Suzanne Ashworth's book, Seed to Seed. Covers a lot of different plant families. So as a book, I'd recommend that one. And then I'd say my most valuable learning has really come from other farmers. So if you have someone in your bioregion that is also a seed grower, whether they do it commercially or just as a hobby, it's just so helpful to be able to trade ideas between people. And so I just suggest seeking those folks out, and seed share opportunities in the springtime are often great times where seedy folks come together and swap seeds. So if you haven't been to one yet, or you don't know who to talk to, that's probably a pretty standard place where you can meet up with other people who are interested in seeds. But yeah, I find that other farmers that have been the most helpful to me in my life as a seed grower.
Brilliant. Thank you. How about you, Dan?
I think the biggest thing that had the biggest impact on me was starting to go to the Organic Seed Alliance conference. And I had been saving seed for about 7 or 8 years before I went to that conference. And I read, there wasn't that many books. There's more resources now. But when I went there, I learned, so I went in 2008, and it felt like it took me 2 to 3 years to unpack everything I learned in that one experience. A 1 or 2 day intensive beforehand. They'll have tours, and so I mean, at this point when I go more to hang out with people, but if you're new, you can probably spend 5 days just so deep into learning all kinds of stuff. And everybody at the conference is into seed, and like when you're at a, like, so right now these days it's virtual for different kinds of reasons, but when it's in person and you're sitting down for breakfast or lunch, anyone you talk to could be a head plant breeder somewhere, or somebody who's really into something like some kind of seed. Like there's just so much skill and experience, and I made a lot of good friends that way. But it just learned so much, and so I don't think there's anything that has that density of knowledge out there.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for that. Absolutely. Eric, how about you?
Yeah, seed to seed was actually pretty influential with me as well, and still remains a pretty good resource. I like the layout of it, and it's got a lot of good information in it. And the other thing that I've used and just gleaned little bits of information here and there are some of the books that like the flower seed industry has put out. And I think there's one called Flower Seeds, Their Biology and Technology. A weird title, but I think it's in that book that I got the idea to harvest marigold seeds with a vacuum, because commercially, on a large scale, they actually harvest marigold seeds with a giant vacuum combine. So just little things like that, like
Wow.
looking what the big companies are doing.
Yeah.
They don't let a lot of information out, but the people who wrote those textbooks, and I think some of them are college textbooks, there's a few of them around, a few different titles, but the people who wrote them are like former employees of these big companies, and you can get little pieces of information here and there, and I think they're worth looking at. A lot of it is geared towards like nursery production for like bright red zinnias or whatever, but there's some good stuff in there.
Brilliant. Yeah. And then when you're as innovative as you guys, I know it'll cause all kinds of great ideas for making it appropriate for the right scale. Well, I think we're kind of running out of time, and I'm just going to say thank you guys so much. Holy schmolies, have I learned a lot. My head hurts. I got old brain cells and I feel new ones growing. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca. Thank you, by the way, Rebecca, and the Bauta Initiative for hosting this, because this is clearly really needed in our flower industry.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Clara, for moderating, Stacey, Dan, Eric. I feel like this topic, we could go on for hours, and we clearly have more to say. So thank you for spending this time with us. It's something that growers constantly ask me about, and this topic of flower seed production. I feel like, as Clara said, I've just learned a lot. My brain is exploding, and I'm very glad it was recorded so that we can go back and pick up information I might have missed the first time. And also thanks to all of you who joined today, dear participants. I welcome your questions, the chats that you've been having. I value everyone's insights and ideas. And so Tara is going to launch just a little quick poll and also throw into the chat a bit of a longer feedback. It's just this flower seed production is such a new area for the Bauta Initiative, and we would love to know what you would like to hear about. So there's a quick poll about the webinar showing up on your screen and then in your chat, and this will also show up in your inbox, will be a little feedback form about the webinar. And I just want to also say that if you have any additional comments, concerns, questions, you can always reach out to me, Rebecca at efao.ca. Just again, thank you for everyone. We have some more exciting things coming up. So Tiara is leading a webinar next week on April 7th on growing heritage grains. And we've posted in the chat this link to the YouTube channel for the Bauta Initiative. It has a lot of our past webinars on there, so you feel free to go and learn and watch on there as well. And yeah, just thank you again so much, everyone. With that, I'll close the webinar. Thank you so much.